Yep.
Welcome to our live conversation today, programmed as part of a series of live Sunday sessions. I'm Diane Similas, the Curator and Gallery Coordinator at Glenara City Council. Today, we're celebrating 1960s fashion in Melbourne with our special guests, Deborah Daskell, Brian Samuel, and Tom McAvoy. Before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation who have traditional connections to the land now known as Glenara. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship to this land. So this week, we're presenting an engaging conversation about Melbourne's vibrant and innovative fashion scene in the 1960s, with a focus on some local fashion stories and identities. I'm really delighted to have local residents, Deborah Daskell, the daughter of fashion designer Simon Scheinberg, founder of fashion houses Shireen Creations and Mr. Simon, Brian Samuel, director of the Melbourne fashion label Miss Hartnell, and fashion historian and collector of Australian-made fashions, Tom McAvoy, joining me as special guests today. Can I ask the audience to please start posting your questions on our YouTube chat, and we'll try to respond to them at the end of today's conversation. So Brian, I'll start with you. Your fashion label, Miss Hartnell, established in '65, was a leading label in Melbourne in the 60s and very popular with the youth market. Can you share some stories about the vibrant fashion scene in Melbourne that you were immersed in and this revolutionary decade of cultural and social change, which saw the emergence of the youth generation?
Thanks very much, Diane, and it's a pleasure to be talking to both residents here in Glenara and also to the rest of the community that have zoomed in today in the middle of a very cold winter day. Look, it was a very interesting time for me. I think one has to probably look at the social history to understand actually what was occurring. At the end of the Second World War, Australia was in a massive amount of debt as a result of the Second World War. And what occurred was a period of austerity throughout the early 50s. Probably towards the end of 1948, you sort of saw the Dior new look come in, and that was really the start of kicking fashion into the 50s and 60s. Now, when I came in, traditionally the clothing industry here in Melbourne had been primarily under the auspices of migrants from the Second World War. They're either Holocaust survivors or they had migrated here just prior to the Second World War. And the emphasis was really on brand names rather than on individual designers. I came in as an 18-year-old straight from a private boys' school and walked into this world of fashion. I suppose at 18 years of age, the hormones are running around at a million miles an hour, and coming out of a boys' school into a fashion environment where there was just glamour and I suppose in inverted commas, sex underlying everything. It was a real eye-opener to me. But you saw this emerging trend occurring, and I think that probably occurred in Europe with the young designers becoming to the forefront. And that sort of trend very quickly followed here in Australia. What you saw is the emergence, rather than of brand names, you saw the emergence of designers as individuals. And that whole market actually shifted away from what I call the traditional Jewish proprietors that were running or heavily involved in the clothing industry, into a whole group of young people that had graduated out of the design school. And I mentioned the names of Thomas Wardle, Kenneth Perry, Norma Tallow, Prue Acton, and I can go on. There was maybe about a dozen of those. None of those really had any association with parents who'd been in the industry. Whereas in my case, I came into the family business as a second generation, or in this case, third generation. And it was an absolute real eye-opener to me. I was moving into an organisation which was really at its pinnacle, Hartnell of Melbourne, had won in its 2 or 3 years prior to me joining the company 3 Gowns of the Year. And in those days, that was the equivalent of the Oscars for the clothing industry. So I came in to an organisation that had an extremely high reputation. I also had a father who was very meticulous and set fairly high standards, fairly high standards in the way in which you dressed and the way in which you behaved and so on. And on one side, there was a degree of conservatism. On the other side, probably, you know, within the same block or environment, you had this whole group of young people which were getting up to all sorts of tricks. They were probably the first or the very early stages of promotion of what I call personal PR promotion, whereas prior to that period in 1960, early 1960s, it was more about promoting the label, as I'd mentioned. So when I came in, the first thing I did is actually employ a young designer, a young lady by the name of Christine Hooker, and a lot of her designs you're seeing here on the Zoom meeting this afternoon. I had absolutely no clues about the clothing industry. I had zero clues about business, and probably could be argued the same thing applies today. But Christine came very well talented, and between the two of us, we were able to promote this young fashion in evening wear, which was very, very popular throughout the 1960s.
So, Brian, can you talk a bit about some of the signature fashion trends that emerged during the 60s? So, you know, mini pantsuits, hot pants, later on the maxi gowns, and some of the vibrant colours and patterns that emerged during this period of social and political change?
Well, what happened is the European trend, and we followed very, very closely to what was happening in the UK, because I do recall about 2 years after I was into business, I think on my 21st birthday, I did fortunate enough to do a world trip. I think my father said to me, he said, you can either have a 21st birthday or a trip overseas. And I said, I'll have the overseas trip. Thanks very much. I haven't got that many friends to worry about. But one of the highlights was visiting what was the miss shops all around the place. You know, in London, you went into Harrods. I recall going into Harrods with the agent there, and she must have been in the mid-60s. And I think that was probably the first time she'd ever been into a miss shop. But then you started to see all this emergence of everything was turned on its head. So, you know, the Twiggy look, the mini skirt, you saw hot pants, you saw culottes, no bras, you know, feminism was coming to the fore. And all of these were interpreted in some way or other in what we were doing. So if we were doing evening wear, we would do a hot pants in an evening fabric, and then we'd attach it with a skirt which had a split down the middle so that we're keeping in line with it. Where culottes were worn in day wear, we did the same thing into culottes, which we did into the evening wear fabrics in crepe or in soft draping fabrics. So every trend that was emerging was interpreted into some way into evening wear. And it was a really amazing period. You also find, as you can see from the aqua coat that's been shown here in the photograph, I've got to admit honestly, in retrospect, a lot of the design that was being done in Miss Hartnell was a interpretation of what was being done at the better end in the Hartnell of Melbourne and its associated Rail Couture label. There was a lot of controversy within the organisation at that time, in that the senior designers were upset that the young designers were copying their ideas, but copying was standard fare for the industry. So if my father's designers were using brocade, we would use brocade, as you can see here. If they were using lace, well, then what they would use the French or the European lace is very, very expensive. We'd go out and buy the Korean lace and, you know, by accident copy a similar thing and put it out at probably about 1/4 the price. And I worked on the premise, look, if I'm not going to do it, somebody else is going to do it, so better be in our pocket than in the opposition's pocket. And that was the way in which we approached it.
So, Brian, can you talk a bit about Melbourne at the time was the most important centre of fashion in Australia due to the number of textile and garment manufacturers located in Flinders Lane. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, I did.
Brian, can you unmute, please?
Unmute. Can you unmute, please, Brian? Yeah.
I've unmuted, yes.
Yeah.
I noticed that between the area of Spring Street and if you went down to Elizabeth Street, there were something like 70 clothing manufacturers alone in that Flinders Lane area. Now, in addition to that, every major textile wholesaler was in that period as well. So, you know, you really didn't have to step far. It wasn't a matter like it is, you know, probably in the later 70s or 80s where you had to get in a car and go to Carlton or Brunswick or whatever it is. If you actually wanted to buy fabrics for your new collection range, you'd start up at the top of Flinders Lane at Macau Macbeth, and you'd walk your way down to Elizabeth Street, and in a couple of days you could go and see all the collections of fabrics that you required, literally in 48 hours. Now, that was the most economical way of doing it. The same thing actually applied in the retailers coming from interstate. They actually would start at the top of Spring Street, and they work their way down in the fashion houses to the Elizabeth Street, you know, over a week's period. So, you know, with Hartnell being at the top end of the Flinders Lane, it probably acted as an advantage. And it used to be amusing. I remember there was one character, Sid Stanton, who was a fashion agent related to my wife. He always used to stand out in front of 60 Flinders Lane, and he was acting as a spotter for a number of manufacturers. And when somebody came in from interstate, he would be on commission if he dragged them into their showroom somewhere further down the lane. And he created a whole business doing this and became a trade identity. So it was a lot of fun. Look, the whole place was a great deal of camaraderie. You know, they were either coffee shopping in the corner on the corner of Exhibition Street and Flinders Lane. There wasn't all the coffee shops or anything else that existed in those days. You had the Herald and Sun right across the road from Hartnell, so there was close association with the Herald and the Sun. And everybody was sort of friendly with one another. Whilst there was a tremendous amount of rivalry, the whole thing was fun. Now, when you probably get to Deborah, you'll see that there were a number of individuals who took this fun to much greater extremes, and they were sort of a group of party modes, which I never unfortunately participated in, but you often heard lots of fantastic stories about the drinking and whatever else that went on in that period. So that was all in relation to what was happening overseas. It just copied here.
Thanks, Brian. Now, Deborah, your father, Simon Scheinberg, was one of a new wave of fashion designers in Melbourne with his labels Shireen Creations and then Mr. Simon. And he really helped to shape the youth market in Melbourne in the 60s. What do you consider to be some of your father's greatest achievements as a designer?
Well, thank you, Diane, and thank you for being included in today's conversation and helping to remember what my father did with his label back then. I suppose Dad's greatest achievement in the mid-60s was the trouser suit, which is on the mannequin behind me. Back in those days, it became very obvious coming from the Paris runways that pantsuits were becoming the #1 item. So my father came back to Australia and produced a range of trouser suits. And in those days, in the early 60s, women were not allowed to go into restaurants or nightclubs or bars with pants on. So my father always believed in using the media to his advantage. and started off at Lennon's Hotel in Brisbane and stood out the front with 3 models. And the press interviewed him, and Lennon's Hotel refused him entry. Then he moved down to Sydney, to a hotel down there where he was refused entry. And then he moved off to Adelaide and went to the Lido Hotel. And the Lido Hotel welcomed Dad and his models, and they were welcome in their pantsuits. This made front page news all round the country, on every city that he visited. And it was after that women were allowed to wear pants in lots of different areas. So I'd say that was probably one of the major things that he did, particularly for women in the mid-60s.
Mm. And we can see on the screen here your father in Osaka in Japan,
Yes.
where he exported a lot of his garments. Can you talk a bit about that, Deborah?
Yes, in the mid-60s as well, my father won the largest fashion export to Japan at the time. He was the first to export to Japan, to Canada, to India, Malaysia, and to South America. And he also imported from New Zealand. So that was a really big thing in those days, to win those sort of contracts and to expand his label globally at the time, which was very exciting for him.
Mm. And one of his other innovations was the fashion range known as the Beatles dresses in 1964, which really appealed to the youth market at the time.
Yes.
And we'll see some images coming up on the screen in a minute, but would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, so Dad was always looking to use the media, if I could say that, to his advantage. So the Beatles, as we all know, were very big overseas, and the Beatles had announced a tour, and that's the photo there.
That's it.
Beatles had announced a big tour coming to Australia. So my father went to the Beatles management and asked for a license to reproduce a brand of clothes called the Beatles dresses, of which he then also was very fortunate enough to get all the 4 Beatles signatures, and the signatures were actually on the swing tickets of every garment that was sold. My father thought this was going to be great. He didn't realise how great it was going to be, and he actually sold out the whole range Australia-wide within about 3 to 4 hours.
Mm.
So I can see from many of my mum's notes, she had said if they had bought thousands and thousands of metres of these fabrics, that they would have been able to do a lot more with it. But he was in the paper across, again, Australia with his Beatles dresses. And also, too, they had Beatles hats, shoes and stockings that went with these dresses. So it was a whole complete outfit.
Mm. And another innovation was the silver mini dress that was designed by Neville Singh, I believe, in the mid-60s, 66.
Yes, yes. That was one of the first garments made out of kangaroo skin. And with that particular garment being a mini, and the 60s became, as Brian has mentioned, very much the skirt raised quite a long way up. And that particular garment was actually sold into America and taken with the picture that you saw with the presentation to America. So very exciting times for him.
Yeah. Thanks, Deborah. Now, Tom, you're a fashionista. You have your own amazing collection of Australian-made fashion, and you're a fashion historian. So would you like to ask Deborah and Brian some questions?
Yeah, because I guess it's like, I guess you could say I'm a fashion historian. I think of myself more as a fashion anthropologist, because I guess I'm much more focused on the way people relate to historical garments or historical objects. And so I guess it's like, the first question that I have for Deborah is, when we first
Tom, could you speak up a little bit? Yeah.
So when I first met with you, Deborah, you didn't really have many garments from your father in your collection, maybe just like 1 or 2. So I'd love to talk to you about what was your process of, what's your, I guess, journey in collecting all these artifacts from your father?
Sorry, I didn't actually hear that question, Tom. What was the question?
There's some noise.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess it's like, let's talk about your process and your journey in, I guess it's like bringing back all these artifacts of your father into your life and how that's made you feel. And let's and sort of talk about that process, because you've almost like you've come a long way from not having many garments.
Yeah. I suppose that's really, that's thanks to you, Tom. When we first met, you and I were both young at heart at what we have been doing in bringing back the fashion industry. And Tom came and approached me, and it was very new to him and it was very new to me. And I had grown up in the fashion industry, and I think I had worked with my father through the 70s and the 80s. And I think that you take certain things for granted. And you thought, okay, I thought my father would live forever and be able to tell his stories. And I was brought up with all this fashion behind me that it was everyday garments. And so when Tom came about, we then talked about maybe we would have a fashion parade to bring back Dad alive again. And we started by collecting his garments. And when you think about it, these garments are 50, 60, 70 years old. It's not that easy to start with. So thank goodness to Tom, we went through op shops, we went on eBay, we went all different places. And in the beginning, I was finding these dresses for $10, $20, $30. And it was a very exciting time, particularly this pantsuit behind me that is so much history. And it was very exciting to be able to put this collection and to build it together. And my father and mother, because my mother worked in the family business alongside my father for all her married life, basically. And she actually started as my father's house model, which is another beautiful story. And from that, Mum had created a lot of notes, and so had Dad, and Mum had created a lot of scrapbooks. So the history that we've got there in the scrapbooks that I can find and newspaper clippings were fascinating. And I've been able to share that with my family and my children and my grandchildren. And now with Tom, we can share it with the community and start up with a Facebook page and an Instagram page and allow people to know more about what Dad had done, and not just his fashion, but the way that he was always forward thinking and different ideas and supporting different charities. He was not only into fashion, but he very much supported Urella, which was, as we all know, where the Miss Australia Quest started. And my mother was actually in the Miss Australia Quest, so that's where his loyalty was to that. And so it's been very exciting collecting everything and seeing my collection grow. And I now would probably have, I'd say, only about 300 garments of Dad that I've now collected. But thank you, Tom.
That's right. So you've gone from about 1 to about 300, and you have all these garments. How does it feel seeing all these garments back together? Is there kind of like, I mean, you know, through like a sort of a concept of like a regime of value, and like they are just pieces of fabric, but is there like a greater emotional feeling that you get from seeing all these garments back together?
Oh, yes. Most of the garments from the 70s and 80s, because that's when I worked in the business, I remember, because I had to do with the production side of it. But the 50s garments and the early 60s, I wasn't young enough to remember them. And when I start to see them, I look at the quality of these garments, and you would see the same, Brian, the early days fashions, the qualities, the fabrics. I've seen in some of Brian's also fashion parades that I've been to, they're exquisite. And that's why they last. A lot of fashion today is what I call, I'm sorry to say, a little bit more throwaway fashion, whereas our fashion was made to last, and it was interesting, and it was changing with the seasons, and we had real direction with our fashion. So it's been very exciting to see.
Okay. All right, for Brian, so I think what is somewhat astounding is the absolute depth of the industry of practice in Australia at the time, and how sophisticated it was. And that, you know, you have some throwaway lines that we like to use, like the rag trade. Some people like to throw the word out there, schmutters. So I want to talk to you about the time that your father was involved in creating the Nagy, or sort of like this collection of fashion houses that came together to sort of perhaps bring a greater sophistication to the way we sort of explored the industry. Would you be able to talk about your father's role in that, and perhaps how they saw the terminology of frocks and the terminology of rag trade?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so you've used a couple of terms there that, as you know, Tom, I'm a little bit sensitive to. One of my previous employers said to me, never use the word rag trade in front of me at all. We're proud of our industry, and we call it the clothing industry. We don't make rags, we make clothes. And schmutters is obviously a Yiddish expression which degenerates also. So when people do it, I try and pick them up and say we talk about the clothing industry. During if we could just go back historically, during the early 1950s, Australia was very much restricted in the amount of clothing that was available. It was very basic because there were very, very strict textile restrictions that were available. And I do recall having had a look at through the scrapbooks and studying a little bit of the history of it. Around about 1954, I think it was, my father unfortunately had a major fire in Flinders Lane. And whilst a lot of people sort of, these days think that that's a clothing industry thing, that could be taken in the wrong context. You've got to understand that manufacturing in those days was in very old-fashioned buildings, wooden floors. Heating was actually through kerosene heaters, and in this particular case, the kerosene heater had been left on during lunchtime, and it was sitting underneath the dress. They all went out to lunch, and of course the dress, which was in a lightweight fabric and skirt, set it all up, and the whole building went up in flames. They reset themselves up literally within 48 hours. But my father at that stage then applied to the government to get a special license to import fabric in order to help re-establish himself. And having had that particular license, he shot off to Europe and managed to bring in a whole lot of very high quality fabrics. That gave him, in a sense, very much a head start in the manufacturing of what was to be known as couture fashion in Australia. And that was in the mid-50s, because he wanted to get out of, the cheap high volume dress business into something into the couture business. And that's what's really set the whole thing off. That gave him, I think, probably a 6 to 12 month head start against most of his competitors. And then, sort of in the mid-50s, the governments relaxed those regulations and so on. So you had this change. Now then, what happened is you had probably about a half a dozen key manufacturers around Australia that were intent on creating high quality clothing available at what I would call reasonably affordable prices compared to what was being offered in the way of imports. And I mentioned names like Janol, Stephen Glass, Elvie Hill, all of which you're familiar with. And let me say at this point, I have to thank Tom for resurrecting my memory, because about 15 years ago, I relegated everything that I had when we were shifting from one suburb to another to the Jewish Museum, because I thought, well, better that they keep it than it end up in the rubbish bin. And I forgot all about it until a few years ago when Tom sort of sent me a note on the thing, and I thought, I've got to start scratching my brain to remember all of this sort of stuff again. But it's been a fascinating period to actually learn. And I think it's actually a testimony to the clothing manufacturers of that period that you can see garments, whether they're available in eBay or whether they're available in op shops, including the two garments that are sitting on Tom's stand in front of him. They're somewhere in the vicinity of 50 to 60 years old. And the fact that they've survived this period, that they haven't ended up in the rag bin or anything else, is a testimony to the high quality of manufacturing that existed in that day. And that was sort of the norm. It was domestic manufacturing. Now then, what in fact happened, as you know, is quite common knowledge. throughout the late 60s, there was a slowly gradual trend of Australia opening up to the rest of the world. And then all of a sudden, tariffs came in and, importing started to become a big thing. And that really became the beginning of the end of the clothing industry. There was two things that occurred. One is you had a massive development in the CBD area. So buildings, for instance, the whole of the block from Spring Street right down to Exhibition Street got demolished literally in 12 months with the development that exists there now, which is, I think, the ANZ Bank and one of the major hotels. And then if you move down, you've got sort of 100 Collins Street. So all of those clothing manufacturers that existed all disappeared because they were just taken over by multi-million-dollar developments. They moved into the suburbs only really for a short period of time, because then what happened from the late 60s and early 70s, you then started to see this very, very rapid change towards importing. So I know in my father's business, the manufacturing of Hartnell and even Miss Hartnell just became economically not sustainable. You could go and import the same thing at 2/3 the cost or half the cost as you could from, in those days, Hong Kong. China hadn't opened up. Hong Kong, Taiwan and Korea became the major importing countries for clothing. And that's when you started to see the movement towards high volume disposable clothing. High fashion tended to sort of slowly disappear from the market. People just didn't want it. They just didn't want to spend that sort of money. And then you also have a look at the other side of the coin, the development of the the electronics industry and everything else. So the amount of money, the disposable income that was being spent on clothing as a percentage of household income was decreasing every year. So local manufacturers were just closing up left, right and centre. If they didn't go into importing, they ended up going broke.
Tom, I've got a question for you. It's fantastic to see you researching and collecting Australian-made fashion. Do you have any particular fashion trends from the 60s that you're, particularly fond of or focusing on in terms of your collecting and research?
I guess the 60s, from my perspective and sort of the work that I do, I guess you could say I do lots of enlivening work. So I'm not like a historian who will look at a garment and then figure out the fabric, the date and all that kind of stuff. That's part of it. So the 60s is interesting from my perspective because of its simplicity in some aspect, because you've got like the mini dresses, you've got the shift dresses. In the early 60s, you had, your father, Deborah, brought out the sort of the sack dress kind of look in some of the early 60s. So it is interesting for me because coming from a background where, as you can see, some of the fashions we have today are very sort of like eye-catching. So that is the interesting part from my perspective, is how do I frame curiosity and intrigue into some trends in fashion which are quite minimalist. So yeah, I guess it's like the pastel colors, you got the little ensemble dresses. I guess it's like me, I'm thinking about how do I explore that through a contemporary lens and get people intrigued. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think there's also the fact, Tom, if I can add, that the 60s was probably the most radical period for change in the clothing industry. Yes. As I was saying before, you came out of an austere period in the 50s and there was the emergence of fashion, but the 60s just turned everything up on its head. I sort of almost compare it to the introduction of the Apple iPhone, and what that did in terms of electronics and the change in the way in which we behave, or the introduction of the internet, how that's really changed society. Now, in the 60s, nothing was taken as being, you must do it this way or you must do it that way. You had this youth rebellion which was which went right through in every industry. I mean, you know, you only got to have a look through the late 60s with the anti-war movement. Now, if you go into fashion, the young designers were saying, look, you know, we could give a hoot what the older generation is doing. This is what we want to do, and this is what we want to do for the young generation. And specifically, what they were doing is they were changing the scene away from providing fashion for what I call the 30, 40 and 50-year-olds to creating it for teenagers. They became the central point because their parents started to develop what I call middle-class wealth. And then also the young people were going out into the workforce and all of a sudden earning a wage and had this highly disposable income, which they wanted to put into fashion. And you saw the development right throughout the industry. Every major department store had a Miss Shop. The likes of Sports Girl and the equivalents interstate all were all geared towards a population anywhere from 13 up to 30. And that's how the whole thing, it became a revolution. It's easy to look back in retrospect, but at the time you don't think about it. It's easy to look from a historical point some 50 years later and see how the whole thing's changed.
Yeah. And Brian, can you talk about, you know, the shift in the fashion trends? So from the late 60s, you see hemlines dropped, maxi dresses were all the rage. So that sort of transition in fashion trends from the late 60s to the early 70s.
Yeah, well, sort of, you know, you went through these phases because, you know, when skirts they crept up and they crept up and they crept up and they kept getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and everyone said, well, if they get any shorter, they're going to end up not have any length in their skirts whatsoever. So, you know, the old story, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So what they did is they went completely the other direction and went into maxi dresses. And then maxi dresses, you know, became loose-fitting, as you've seen here in a couple of the photographs. So whilst the short dresses were still available in day wear to a certain extent, what you had in evening wear is this sort of return to loose-flowing maxi dresses, and that was all part of, I think, this sort of free-flowing environment that existed during that period. When I sort of look back and see it compared to today, it's interesting. I remember walking around one of the shopping centres just prior to retiring and seeing a whole group of women's wear shops providing lace dresses throughout 2019. I thought, well, all this is doing is taking me back 50 years ago, because it's the same styles, the same fabrics, the same look, and you know, the whole lace generation of the last couple of years is just a repetition of what occurred in the 60s. You know, it was just you know what goes around. I remember actually recalling talking to one of the fabric suppliers, probably in the first year I was in business, and my father used to keep a very big textile book with a cutting of every fabric that he bought from wherever he bought it from. And the person there was giving me a lesson, and he said, if you keep your mind to it, he said, and you can look back over your father's history book in these books here, which go back, you know, at that stage, probably 20 or 30 years, you'll find that every 7 years, the cycle goes around again. So if you're not sure what's going to happen next year, just go back to the last cycle and you can copy it. And I think that applied then. I'm not sure whether that applies today because I've been out of women's wear for so many years. But it was a very good guide.
Now, we've got some questions from the audience today, which is great. So, Deborah, I've got a question for you. Did Miss Hartnell and Shireen, or for both of you actually, did Miss Hartnell and Shireen Fashions experiment with the new fabrics and new technologies?
Well, my father was always experimenting with all fabrics and all technologies throughout his whole career. So in the very early days, he was starting with particularly wool and washable wool, and won many awards through the Wool Association in the very early days. Then he moved into cottons, polyesters, leathers, combining all these sorts of things. So yes, he was all the time looking at the technology of fabrics and clothing, and particularly in the 60s, as Brian had mentioned, everything was available to you in Australia. Do you know? So you could get pleating done, you could get embroidery done, you could get anything done here within Australia. If I look back at my father's career in the 60s, Dad had 3 factories. He was employing over 300 people, and he was producing 100,000 garments a year.
Wow.
And in the 60s, that's what kept our whole nation going. The fashion industry was very important. And then it all changed with imports. And yes, my father used to import some clothes, and I can remember when he used to import the boob tube. I remember the very first garment that he actually imported was a shirt, and it arrived with 2 left sleeves. And that was an absolute disaster for us with the technology and trying to work through that with working with overseas factories. So all the way through, he worked with things like that.
And Brian, did you want to add to that?
Yes, look,
in relation to Miss
I've
Hartnell?
been fortunate in having been involved for well over 50 years in the clothing industry. And it's interesting, I've always been interested in the technological advances that have occurred. You've got to remember that prior to the Second World War and probably post-Second World War, Australia was basically restricted to 2 fabrics, which was cotton and wool. After the Second World War, you saw this massive, huge development in synthetic fabrics, polyester, nylon, viscose, etc. Now, that was all basically coming out of Japan initially. They were the most innovative in that area. And later on, you saw the whole development coming out of Europe of spandex, lycra, whatever you want to call it, elastomeric fabrics. I've always been at the forefront of this. One of the things that was inculcated into me by my father is that if you see a new fabric and it's within the price range of what you're doing, go for it. And that's sort of something that's really stood me stead right throughout the whole of my industry experience. I remember even if I go into the 70s when I was with Pacific Dunlop, I was associated with a major denim brand called Britannia Sportswear. We were the first in the country to bring out a denim with logos on it, was using a technicality. We were the first company to bring out stretch denim, which had lycra in it and so on. I can go on for ages, but we're talking about the 60s. So it's always been sort of something of mine is if I see something new, let's experiment with it and let's see it. And that's probably carried right through probably until, the last 4 or 5 years that I've been in the industry. Because it's something that if you don't experiment, you don't sort of have a go at it, somebody else is going to do it. And I've learned over the years that the first person that gets in with new technology is usually the one that's going to really, be the king of the trade in that particular area. So I've always pushed for that. But I've seen massive change in fabrication. I think synthetic fibres in itself became the major trend change in the Australian fashion industry. That's what led to all the disposable fashion. And easy to wear, not only easy to wear, but easy to maintain. That's what people are looking for.
And we've got another question from the audience, which is sort of continuing on from what you've been talking about, Brian. Could you advise what the downturn of Australian fashion was?
Yeah, look, it was very simple. The beginning of the end was the reduction of the 25% tariff by the Labor government, I think in 1975, if history's got me correct. It was starting to occur prior to then, but in 75 with a 25% tariff reduction, that was the nail in the head. That was the final straw to manufacturing. Now, fortunately, in our case, we'd started importing prior to then. But, if I went around and looked at the industry historically, I would say that it decimated probably 60 or 70% because most of the manufacturers either were elderly and couldn't be bothered starting to import, or B, they sat on their rear sides and said, "Oh well, look, it's not going to happen." And you know, it's one of those things. You know, if you don't get onto the bus, you're going to just miss it.
Thanks, Brian. And Deborah, now a question for you. Where do you display the 300 outfits that you've collected of your father's?
Okay. Well, at the moment, they're in my home. But I have worked with Tom a few years ago now, and we did a complete Mr. Simon and Sharing Creations fashion parade at Brighton International, which was very exciting to do. So we did the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s fashion. We were very fortunate to work with yourself as well, and we had an exhibition at the Glenara Town Hall. But at the moment, they're in a room in my house and sort of taking over in a couple of rooms at the moment. Yeah.
And it was wonderful to have a lot of your garments in the exhibition at Glenara City Council Gallery a few years ago during that 60s fashion exhibition, which was so popular, and also some garments by Miss Hartnell and also Hartnell of Melbourne, and a lot of works from, or garments from, Tom's private collection. So, look, we're getting so many questions from the audience, which is fantastic. It's a wonderful conversation. Another question, which designers or shops in Europe were you influenced by?
If you're asking me,
yeah, Brian.
The answer to that question is twofold. There were probably 4 or 5 European designers at that time, Yves Saint Laurent, Pierre Cardin, etc., in that category, which were influenced. You've got to understand, I think, 2 things. One is that international travel wasn't like it is today. You didn't have the internet, you didn't have so much, whilst you had television, you didn't have the information technology that you have today. So most of the design influence was coming through in magazines, European magazines. You had Harper's Bazaar, you had American Vogue, European Vogue, etc., etc. We used to spend an inordinate amount of money on fashion magazines. And from those, the designers, in fact, interpreted their designs. I've always said there's nothing original in the clothing industry. Everything's an interpretation upon something else. So, you know, a designer, I think my father would initially look through the magazines and then he'd rip out a page and then pass it on to one of his designers. Sometimes he'd rip out the same thing out of 2 magazines and give it to both designers to see who was the first one to pick it up as a bit of competition. But in the case of Miss Hartnell, that was also a little bit more difficult because most of the design that was coming from these European magazines was designed for an age group that were much older than I was catering for. So the designers that I had working basically either were from what they could read in the local newspapers, or more importantly, quite honestly, they just rip off the designs that my father was doing and put a younger look on it. You know, I can say that historically because nobody's around to argue against me.
I'd like to add something here as well. So I think, yeah. So there is a separation sometimes between the glamour and the excitement that we see in the magazines and from the TV of the 1960s, and all the Youthquake and all the the Mary Quants and all this kind of stuff. But behind the scenes, talking to a lot of people, it was a really challenging time. Some labels were very successful. Some that I know, I won't name names, they had their, one designer I'm speaking to said he talked about the cold sweats where he'd wake up in the middle of the night just sweating profusely, thinking, how am I going to pay my staff, my machinists, the factories? It was a real challenge, to the point where some labels actually went overseas, bought sample ranges in, perhaps like for one instance from New York, they bought the whole sample range, brought it back to Melbourne, just took off the label and stuck their own label on it, and then sent it off to sort of buyers, because the pressure in this such a competitive industry was sometimes great. Because Brian talks about how some labels shut down towards the 60s, so at the end of the 60s. So it definitely was a challenging time where perhaps the glamour that we see outwardly through the media historically didn't match, sometimes the chaos internally, because you had big competitions between, like, Terylene, the synthetic fabric Terylene, which was, a huge, massive global influence by ICI Industries. That really challenged our wool industry. And then they even poached some of our best marketing and illustrators from the wool board, and thus having to change the whole balance. And, they signed up all these little manufacturers one by one because they had all this money. So, and then obviously that was, ICI were in competition with fiber makers, who were in competition with Universal Fabrics, who were in competition with some of the Japanese, Toyo. And it was all this kind of like, we have all this, like Arnell came from America and they signed up manufacturers. So it was definitely a chaotic world behind the scenes that perhaps you don't see sometimes when you're looking at the 60s.
And
it reminds me, Diane, of when Tom talks about going overseas. If I go a few years ahead of this time, when I was involved in the jeans industry, we were licensed with an American company, which was the major jean fashion brand worldwide at this period. But a lot of the designs they're showing us just weren't suitable for Australia. And we started travelling on a regular basis, probably 2 or 3 times a year, up through Japan, the States and America. And I used to see designs in Japan, which I thought were fantastic for our Australian market. And I'd bring them back, and I didn't have time to have samples made up or anything. I'd just rip all the labels off and get a label stitched on there and take it down to Just Jeans as part of the collection. The only one that was probably astute enough to realise what I was doing was Craig Kimberley. He often pulled me up and he said, "Brian, you're a bloody thief." He said, "That's not from there, that's from Isatan in Japan." I said, "If you like it, Craig, we'll have it made and show it to you. But in the meantime, that's it." But that's the way the trade worked. That's what I'm saying. Nothing's original.
Yeah, but in my father's case in the 60s, my father was very involved actually with Qantas, and he was quite different in the regard that my father, and I can remember this as a child, was away for about 6 months a year. So he was actually one of Qantas' most frequent flyers during the 60s, and he was always just jetting between London, Paris, New York and LA, and then interstate. And he would bring back samples, he would bring back sketches, because my father was also a designer himself. And he would bring back buttons and garments, and he would actually come back with sometimes 2 to 3 suitcases full of ladies' clothes. And he used to tell beautiful stories in the early days. He used to say, "And how did you get through customs with all those ladies' clothes?" And he used to say that he would buy a product and give it to the customs guys, because they got to know him, as a present to allow him to come through with all those samples. And as a contra deal, the Qantas actually then allowed Dad to use the Qantas logo, and he produced a brand of Qantas dresses with their logo for advertising, because he was such a frequent flyer. So that was a very different way that he did business, because he was constantly going backward and forward. Qantas planes.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. We've got so many questions to get through. I'm mindful of the time, but we'll go through address a couple more questions. So the next one is, where do you think that clothing manufacturing will head with the current issues relating to COVID and offshore manufacturing?
It won't come back to Australia, that's for certain. You might find that once COVID is relaxed, I know there's been a lot of bleating and blowing about China, but you've got to look at the fact that substantially probably 90% of clothing manufacturing today comes from China. I don't see that substantially changing. I think that will continue. However, if there is a severe change in the economic relationships between excuse me, Australia and China, what you'll see is that it'll move to another third world country. I mean, there's already stuff that's been coming out of Vietnam and a little bit coming out of Sri Lanka and India and so on and so forth. But China has become a very, very sophisticated clothing manufacturer for the entire clothing industry. And I don't see that changing in any way whatsoever. Look, people are talking about resurgence of Australian industry, and we know that there are some manufacturers still producing here in Australia, but, you know, it's either on a very small scale or, you know, there hasn't been what I would call the technological advances in the clothing industry that would cause it to come back here. There hasn't been the introduction of robotics or anything. If you walk into any factory overseas, you'll see that the sewing machine is basically the same sewing machine that was operating in the 60s. It's probably a little bit more high powered and it's probably got a few extra functions on it. But clothing industry has always been the development of third world countries, and you saw that in Southeast Asia after the Second World War, where Korea was absolutely devastated. You know, all the big names in electronics that you see today, whether it be Samsung or Daewoo, etc., all actually clothing manufacturers or textile manufacturers. And then they developed into to the high-tech motor cars, electronics, etc., etc. So I don't see that substantially changing. For better or worse.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Brian.
Also to the cost for us to produce here in Australia, it's just too expensive. I think the small boutique, hopefully that we will find some young new fashion graduates coming with their own small labels, and they will start up here in Australia, and I think that we need to all support them and support Australian made as much as we can if there's any left.
Yeah. Thanks, Deborah. And Tom, a question for you. So how do you see fashion in Melbourne and Australia compared to the 60s and 70s?
So does that mean like comparing what fashion in the 60s to fashion in the 70s?
Yeah. So fashion now compared to the 60s and 70s.
Fashion now. So that's an interesting question. So I feel like if we're talking about fashion now, and compared to fashion in the 60s and the 70s, obviously I feel like on a general scale, because we're talking about like, you know, massive variations and things like that, I guess I would say, as you can see here with these two garments, I think in the 60s and the 70s there was a lot more colour compared to perhaps what we see today. I would say that, the garments were a lot more expensive, I would say, on average, compared to perhaps what, say, if a young woman was going to pop down to Myer to buy a dress, I would say what the starting point for a dress back then would have been in the hundreds. I've got friends today who buy full-length dresses for about $3 online. And, you know, I've got, just last night I was having a conversation with a friend who was buying swimwear for $2, all these different $2 swimwear sets. So I would say if I was like a young woman today and I had $150 to spend on fashion, I could buy myself a complete wardrobe from gowns to sort of like everything in between, just down to singlets and t-shirts. I could buy myself like 30 garments, but perhaps $150 in the 60s probably would have bought me something very simple and something got me very far.
Yeah.
I think the thing that's, if I could just comment, I think the thing that's radically changed is that the actual world has become very small. I remember going on my first overseas trip in 1968, I think it was, and you actually went overseas to have a look at fashion, right? You don't need to do that anymore because you've only got to have a look at what's occurred in the year 2019. We won't talk about this year. Every major retailer at every level, whether you're talking down in the sort of the top shops or whatever the case, they've got stores. Zara, for example, is a perfect example. Now, Zara's got stores all over the world. What's available in Zara in Spain today is available in Melbourne tomorrow. At the top end, you've seen Collins Street here in Melbourne change from what it was to you could be walking down the main street of Milan or the main street of Paris and seeing all the top European designers. So that's the first thing, is that the world has become exactly the same. I think secondly, what you're actually seeing is you're seeing not only a similarity, but you're seeing a much greater variety than what was available back in the 60s and 70s. You know, if you can't find it here, as Thomas said, just go onto the internet. You know, you've got a million sites that you can go onto electronically and you can get it, and you don't actually have to keep it. If you don't like it, you just send it back. So all of that is what's drastically changed over the last 40 or 50 years. And that's why fashion, as a disposable income, as a percentage of disposable income, is negligible to what it was back in the 50s and 60s.
Thanks, Brian. And this is a question for all of you. So how influential is the desire for sustainable clothing?
I'm happy to answer that. In the sense that it's interesting, I was reading an article about it yesterday, and I speak here and say I think there is a degree of cynicism that's occurring in the clothing industry in terms of sustainability. I mean, people talk about they're using traceable wool in their clothing. Now, look, you know, one's got to actually know the farmer, where the wool's coming from, know where the fabric's being processed, the wool's being processed, know where the wool's being woven, and know where it's actually coming from. And I would suggest to you, with a degree of cynicism, that's probably a little bit beyond the pale. I see that people are talking about sustainability. I think sustainability occurs if you're using fabrics that you know can be either reused or can be regrown. But when I sort of, you know, and I've had a couple of conversations with retailers that are talking about they're only using sustainable fabrics, and I've rung them up as not as Brian Samuel from Hartnell, but just as an ordinary consumer, and said, could you elaborate on what you're saying? And when you sort of start delving the questions, you start to get sort of, I think this has been more of a PR exercise rather than a reality. I think everyone's got the intent, but, you know, when you come down to fabrics like people talk about genetically modified or their cotton is Egyptian cotton, 1,000 thread, etc., etc. Well, you know, the only way you can actually tell how some of these fabrics are weather determined is if you do a DNA test. And I can tell you doing a DNA test on every fabric they use is prohibitively cost prohibitive. So I know the ACCC have been looking at this and questioning, you know, the veracity of some of these statements. But I think everyone's intent is there. Whether it's actually occurring in truth, I'm not sure.
Thanks, Brian. Another question. Did a more relaxed and casual lifestyle and hippie youth culture change people's need for couture in the 60s?
Yes. I actually think that led more going into the 70s as well. And I think that there was then almost two classes of women. One that wanted to women's liberation, burn the bra, a different lifestyle. Women then were starting to come more into the workplace. So we had a different role, lots of different roles then for women and lots of needs for different kinds of fashion. So yes, you definitely had different areas to look at. And that, I think, it opened up the fashion industry into lots of new directions as well at that stage.
Thanks, Deborah. And another question, what were actually true Australian designs, or were they copies of what Europe was doing at the time in the 60s?
Okay, I can honestly tell you from Dad's direction and Dad's fashions, we had our own designers. So over the years, we had many different designers. Yes, we would look at trends like the pantsuit and say, okay, pants are now in fashion. But he would design everything from start to end. Yes, he would look at different fabrics, or if something had a lot of embroidery on it or anything, but nothing was 100% a direct copy. Yes, there were slight copies in certain things, but he would bring out his new trends. He even went to, there was a gentleman by the name of Weg, and he was a cartoonist and was very famous for, at the end of the grand final, he would bring out a poster, which was the Weg poster, that would bring out a poster of the winner of the grand final. Dad went to Weg and asked him to draw him some T-shirts. So Weg designed what was known as these T-shirts, and which was a very big thing in those days, that women would wear a T-shirt and be wet in a T-shirt and things like that. So that's sort of a direction, and to show you that he was constantly looking at outside the square of fashion, and it wasn't just following always a trend.
If I can add to that, if you look at the history of Hartnell, you'll see that there were throughout the 50s, 60s and 70s, 3 key designers there. I hold at the top Leonard Legg, who went on to become Professor of Fashion Design at the RMIT. He was a colleague of my father's throughout the 50s and 60s and established the very high brand Rail Couture, Golda Whelan and Lorna White. Now, all of these were highly trained. When I say designers, they were highly trained in the technical side of design, not just the ability to sit down and sketch on a piece of paper, but, you know, I actually used to watch them when they were actually putting a garment together. They were able to cut out their own pattern, draw up their own pattern, cut out their own pattern, and pin the garment, have it machined, do the alterations, etc. So from way to go, they had an expertise which none of the younger designers that I had when they came out of design school. They developed that skill, obviously, working in the environment for a couple of years. Yes, sure, the trends were from overseas, but you can see from the fact that the 2 or 3 gowns of the year that Hartnell and Melbourne won, they were all original designs from highly skilled. However, as I said previously, back in that period, manufacturers tend to keep their designers very much QT. It was something that you didn't want to advertise because you very much prized them. So the emphasis was on promotion on the label. Then when you came into the mid-60s, then you had the individual young entrepreneurs who were, in inverted commas, designers that were promoting themselves rather than their label. So that's when I think you saw the drastic change in the industry.
Thanks, Brian. I think we've got time for one more question. So the question is for Deborah and Tom, how do you store your collections?
That's a very good question. And something that I probably need to work on it in a lot better way. Mine is in a controlled atmosphere room that it's under our house, and it's really what I would consort is more like a wine cellar room. So it's dark, no air conditioning, no heating, and it's in that kind of condition. The scrapbooks and the magazines, I definitely need to have scanned, and that's a much bigger project that I need to digitise.
Thanks, Deborah. And Tom, what about you?
My collection is probably more temporal because I believe that the pieces in my collection are of greater value in the wardrobes of those who are going to wear the garments. So my collection is often shifting, where I'll find something, I'll document it, I'll take photos of it, I'll contemporize it. I'll look to find ways to make it relevant to, like, you know, the millennial generations. So it's all stored under the house, just like Deborah's. But with mine, I sort of like, once I feel like these garments, I've done everything that I can with these garments, I then move them on to places where that can be worn, because ultimately that is, you know, that was the agenda of the garment to be worn. So I try and return that sort of like object space identity of the garment to its original agenda.
Thanks, Tom. So that concludes today's conversation about 60s fashion. I'd like to thank our special guests, Deborah, Brian and Tom, for their participation and sharing their fascinating stories with the audience today. It's been a wonderful conversation. We could talk for hours and hours about 60s fashion. Maybe we should organise another session soon. I'd like to thank all the people behind the scenes who made this event possible. So with special thanks to our technical support, Leo Damiani, and the Council's Arts and Culture team. A reminder to the audience today to please give us your feedback about today's online conversation. We'd like to hear, so we'll be sending a form out soon for you to provide feedback. This conversation was streamed live today and so can be viewed on the Council's YouTube channel on Council's website. So please share with your friends and family. I'd like to promote next Sunday's event, which is the 16th of August, 3 p.m, with aspiring local musician Chloe James. And we look forward to your participation next week. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Bye-bye.